that sometimes when you get to be my age, one of your grandparents maybe was born here in America, or they came from somewhere. So on my dad's side, my grandmother was born in England and came to America when she was about 17. But I didn't know her because she died in childbirth in 1920. And my dad was the oldest child, and his name was Frederick Nafla. Do you know how to spell that?
Yes, I got that one down. How many siblings did he have?
How many what?
Siblings?
He had one sister that passed away as a child, but living, he had a brother who was just younger than him, about 2 years, Walter. And then he had a sister named Dolores, Delores. And then in 1920 is when my grandma, Lily was her name, Lily, and that's when she had another girl, and she was named Lillian after her mother. And she died 2 days about after she was born. I mean, my grandmother, Lily, passed away two days after the baby was born. And she had a midwife because in those days most people did.
Mm-hmm.
And so we don't know what the reason, other than saying she died 2 days after the baby was born. And so she died in 1920. And my grandfather never remarried. And so my dad, Frederick, he was the one who helped my grandpa. My grandpa worked at Brown and Bigelow in St. Paul. He was called tinsmith. So I don't know what he did though at Brown and Bigelow, which was a pretty good job in those days, 1920. But anyway, my grandpa was born in Germany, and his name was Charles. That's why my dad is Frederick Charles.
Mm-hmm.
My grandpa was Charles, and he came on the, they all, both my grandmother, Lily, and he, they came on a ship, but we have never traced it back to see. He should have come to Ellis Island, both of them coming from across the Atlantic Ocean. But, so Charles then raised the family with my dad's help, so that I know that my dad did a lot of cooking for us because he worked nights on the railroad, and so he would always fix our dinner. And my mother worked downtown St. Paul at the Emporium department store, and she'd come home on the bus, and the supper would be ready. So my dad did a lot of cooking, but that since he was born in 1909, my dad, Frederick,
mm-hmm.
he lived during the Depression, because he was 6 years older than my mother, so I don't know that my mother remembered that, but my dad went into the Army, I think for 3 years, and after he got out of high school. And so he was, I called it lucky, but I don't know. He never really talked about it much. He was stationed in Hawaii. But
oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, that would, and I have pictures of him. They up in the mountains, and he did say that their transportation for their supplies, they had donkeys.
Oh, really?
And took the stuff up. And he, so that would have been like, let's see, if he graduated from high school, so he was born in 1909, so 1929. So he probably graduated from high school in 1927 or 27 or 8. And so do you remember, when the Great Depression started?
It was,
it 1929? Was it?
Yeah, 30s and 40s mainly.
Yeah. So he was in the Army for 3 years, and so he was stationed on Hawaii. And I don't really, there was no war going on then, thank goodness. So they were just practicing and doing whatever they did. I don't really know what, but I just know they were stationed up there, and they had. I've got a picture of him. He worked sometimes as a cook. He worked sometimes in the like the hospital tent. It was very not glamorous.
Do you know how your dad's parents met?
I don't know, and I've often thought of that. But at the time when I was young, they didn't talk about the old country. My grandpa didn't. My dad didn't really, other than that his dad, my grandpa, came when he was only 7 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So he learned English coming that young.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was easier for him, but I did get a copy of the 1920 census. They lived in St. Paul, so you trace it, the state, the county that you live in, which was Ramsey County, that's St. Paul, and then they did a census of every family, and they went door to door. Everybody's house was visited, and so I was looking at, they have a lot of questions, and looking across it, they asked, what language did you speak? And so my grandpa put down that he spoke English, and he had the kids by then. In 1920, the new baby wasn't listed yet because she wasn't born, but my grandma was pregnant. So, and then the question was, what language did your parents speak? And it was written in the census that they spoke Polish.
Interesting.
Now, we were never told that we were part Polish.
Mm-hmm.
But Poland is right next to Germany, and Hitler's army invaded Poland.
Right.
But I don't know the name of the town. But that made me think, well, I wonder if we're even German.
Mm-hmm.
Because what if they were born in Poland and they immigrated to Germany?
Right.
Or because why would my great-grandma and grandpa speak Polish?
Yeah, that's interesting.
So I don't know that answer, and I'd sure like to find it out.
Yeah.
I wonder even what city they got on the ship, but because he gave the answer that they came from Germany.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe, I don't know.
Well, maybe I'll be able to find out someday.
Yeah.
So what about your mom's parents?
My mom's dad was born in Litchfield, Minnesota, but his parents came from Sweden.
Mm.
And I have 2 obituaries of my great-grandpa and my great-great-grandpa. When they died, they both lived in Litchfield, and, you know, then the obituaries were written really, well, I should make a copy of them for you and send them, just because it was flowery, you know, the writing. They said how wonderful he was, and his neighbors, he was just a wonderful, they were wonderful people.
Mm-hmm.
So they came so I'm assuming that my grandpa, so my grandpa and his sister were born in America, but he had a brother and a sister that was born in Sweden. Mm-hmm. And I have pictures of the great-grandma and grandpa, and they just look Swedish to me. It's weird, but that's where Tom went to visit, you know, Uncle Tom,
right,
and Mary, and they went to the town where my great-grandparents lived and were their first 2 children, and that was Malmo, Malmo, Sweden. And he worked, then my grandpa, too, worked on what they called, my Uncle Don called, the summer home of the King of Sweden.
Yeah, I remember that story, them talking about that.
Yeah, and he said they were the gardeners, but Tom's information said they worked in the stables. So they could have been shoveling poop, or they could have been training or cleaning the horses, or they could have been doing garden work besides. So that part I don't know. And a lot of the pages you couldn't read very good, but at least I know that's where they came from. Mm-hmm. And Tom and Mary went to this property by the sea because they came in, Tom and Mary, with friends of theirs from Germany, they came on a sailboat across the Baltic Sea and landed there by Malmo, Sweden. And the king and the queen, I suppose, they came to the seashore for the summer. So that's why that particular place in Malmo, Sweden, I don't actually know what the capital city of Sweden was at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, they were there. I think it does tell in that one article of when they came
mm-hmm.
to America, when they left Sweden. And I'd like to know why, other than if they found out that there was land and you could get land to have a farm, because they did farm when they came to Litchfield, Minnesota, which is west, not real far, maybe 2 hours west of Minneapolis.
Did you take us to that area once? Or did my parents drive out there? I feel like I remember a farm.
Grace and Diane and I took Don and Lola to Litchfield. And when I was a little kid, we went to visit this Aunt Hannah. Her name was Benedicta Hannah, but they called her Aunt Hannah, and she never married, never had children.
And that was
so she lived on this old farm that my mom's cousin, her family lived.
So that was your grandpa's sister?
Yes, his oldest sister. I think she was the oldest and there was a son born in Sweden too, but Hannah and another brother. So when they came to Litchfield, then another sister was born, and she died from breast cancer when she was like 36, I think.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so she had a child, only had one child, and the old aunt Hannah, she took care and raised the little girl because she was only like 6 when her mother died. And even at that, I think that's kind of old for her to have a child. But my mother's cousin was named Anita, and then after that was my grandpa, Frank Youngstrom.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, Uncle Don's name is Donald Zimdars Youngstrom. Well, Zimdars is my grandma Youngstrom's maiden name. So she was Edith Martha Zimdars. And then she married, so she was her family came from Sweden. And I have a picture of them, and there was like 5 kids. And then when they got to America, my grandma was born. So she's way younger than her brothers and sisters.
Yeah.
So, and I have a cousin that looks just like her. It's just weird when you look at the picture and they look alike. How families, how they look alike.
Mm-hmm.
Down the generations.
Do you know how those two grandparents met?
Pardon me?
Do you know how your mom's parents met?
Well, yes. My grandpa, Frank Youngstrom, he also was on a ship, and he was in the naval. I mean, there was kind of just like with the Air Force. The Air Force was actually started after World War II, I think, when airplanes came in. That so my, Lola's husband Jerry, he was in. We always thought he was in the Air Force, but they didn't start it till after World War II, and he was in World War II. But it was the Marines. What was combined? They came under, the airplanes came under the Marines, but later they called it the Air Force because he had a Marine guard duty by his casket when my Uncle Jerry died. But anyway, so my grandpa, Frank Youngstrom, he was on a ship, so I'm thinking he was in the Navy. And he was born I can't remember. So anyway, he was on a ship. I think it was called the Marblehead. So that, we could trace something through the armed forces. I should ask Edie about that, being she's in the Air Force. But
yeah,
that was the ship he was on, and he used to send articles back to his sister that was just a little older than him, and she worked for the newspaper in Litchfield, and they would print the stories that my grandpa, and Diane has that scrapbook because she saved them. And I've never read them. I got to get some of this from Diane. She's got the big tubs of pictures that the family has, the Youngstrom family, and see what we can trace through that there. But I know that when he was still in the Navy, say, He was in California when that big earthquake happened, and it caught on fire, and I think it was San Francisco. So he was on guard duty. They had to guard everything, while this national tragedy was happening of an earthquake. And so then he stayed in, because when he came back to Minnesota, they gave him the job of being recruiter. I don't think that was in the beginning, because I don't think he would have gotten married and gone in the service. I think it was more. So my oldest uncle, was born in 1909, like my dad was born in 1909. And he was stationed in Wisconsin. I wonder if it's Ripon. Ripon, Wisconsin, is where he was a recruiter for the Army, or the whatever military. And he met my grandma. And she was, I think, 6 years younger than him. But Diane has a picture of, or the invitation, and they were married at home in Ripon, where my grandma lived on a farm with her family, and that's where they were married. And then they moved to Minneapolis after their wedding, and then eventually moved to St. Paul. But her aunt had a hotel in Minneapolis, and so I don't know where they lived until they moved to Randolph Street in St. Paul, which was the kind of the west side of St. Paul, and that's then where they lived then the rest of their marriage. And so her family came from my grandma Edith. Her family came from Germany, and I think it was my grandpa Nafla, back to him, when he was 7 and they came. They lived, I was told by a cousin, they lived in Nuremberg. That's where the Nuremberg, they tried the Nazi soldiers for all the atrocities that happened during World War II. But, when they lived there, that was a generation away from Hitler, I suppose, that time. So, but they must have been a young couple, because if my dad was only 7, I don't know where in the family he was. If I'm he could have he had an older sister and brother, and in fact, I think he had 3 brothers. So, I just know it was Germany, and I don't know Nuremberg, but I don't know where my grandma's family. And I've asked my Aunt Lola, but at this point, but I have asked off and on through the years, and she says she doesn't know. She doesn't remember her mom saying. So, like I say, people didn't talk about the old country. They were happy to be here in the United States of America and making new lives, and what they had to do to become a citizen, and things like that. And we have the paper, although I think it's called Naturalization, for my grandpa Nafla, and he didn't do that, actually get that paper saying he was a citizen until after my grandma died in childbirth. And he had 1, 2, 3, 4 children to support, and so I don't know what city, but I've got 3 cousins. Well, I've got 3 cousins on my dad's side, his brother's kids. In fact, Diane and I just had lunch about 3 weeks ago with my oldest cousin, who was Grace's age. But he says, I don't know. I was thought, oh, good, we'll have lunch with them and I'll learn something. He said, well, we don't know much either. He said, my dad didn't talk about it, and even my grandpa lived with them for quite a while. And he said he never talked about it. And as a kid or a young person, you don't think about. You know, we didn't have that in our school, grade school or high school. Where did your family come from? Or, you know. So, I know the most about the Youngstrom and pictures, but I don't have any pictures. And I do have what I think is in a two frames that are connected together, so they're really old, and then the backs are like sealed onto it. It's a picture of my grandma Lily Nafla and my grandpa Charles Nafla, but they're each in a separate frame, and they've got, you know, he's got a flower on his suit, and it's kind of a close-up, more of a head. But we don't have hardly any pictures. We've got, you know, different ones through the years of him with his grandchildren. You know, it would be us or my cousins, his sister Dolores's kids. But we don't have any. We've got a few of my grandma, Youngstrom, of her through the years, because she's the only grandma I knew, and my grandpa Nafla is the only grandparent I knew. So we were kind of short on. Look at all mine. They know their grandmas and grandpas and great grandma and grandpa. You guys. So. And we have so little of my dad's side, because, like Uncle Don said, you know, Youngstrom, he said we'd be talking about it or looking at pictures. He said, I don't remember my mom and the girls. He called my mother and Lola, the girls, because they were his little sisters. He said, I don't remember Mom and the girls telling me this stuff about different things. But between us, we thought, well, he was either at work, because he went to work at like 3 to 11 at the newspaper, St. Paul Dispatch in St. Paul. And then he'd come home and read half the night. And then he'd sleep until he had to get up and get ready to go and back to work. And my Lola remembers, because she's 8 years younger than my mother, she remembers Don just not even eating the dinner that she or my grandma made, because he was going to miss the streetcar. The streetcar went down up and down Randolph Street, and he'd run out and down the bank. They were built up a kind of a little bit. So he'd run down the bank and run a half a block to the corner and catch the streetcar at the next corner. They didn't stop in the middle of the block, only at the corners. But if nobody was waiting there, he'd miss it, I would say. So he maybe was a fast runner. But
well, thank you for sharing all that with me.
Well, I wish I could tell you more. It's so hard. When is that due?